one of the surprises is in the course of writing this book. As you mentioned, my father and I have become estranged from one another, and I didn't expect that to ever happen either. And so it was this weird moment in writing the book where these two worlds kind of come to collide, my personal and my professional. And that was another wake-up call of a kind. And a lot of us, 1 in 4 Americans is estimated to be estranged at any given point from a close family member. And so we're all facing this. What do we owe each other? What do we owe each other in life? How much do you put up with when relations are strained? And what do you owe each other after death? And, I found inspiration from the people I had the privilege of studying who really went to great lengths to claim somebody who maybe hadn't been in their life for very long or in the ways that they wanted, and seeing them, do family in a particular kind of way. My father and I are estranged. It doesn't mean I don't love him. And so I would see in my personal circumstance claiming as an opportunity to demonstrate that love and try to right what I feel is a wrong that I wish could be different, which is that, we're not getting along, but, I can't. I also write at the end this project, I should say, with a lot more empathy towards people and the decisions that they're making around these difficult conversations than I probably did when I started.
Pamela Prickett is the co-author, along with Stefan Timmermans, of the book The Unclaimed, Abandonment and Hope in the City of Angels. An associate professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam, Pamela has studied journalism and media at Boston University and at the London School of Economics and earned her PhD from UCLA. Her research into urban inequality, community building, death, dying, and religion led the Houston native to a mosque in Los Angeles where she witnessed a community of non-blood related people fighting for the right to bury a member who died with nobody to legally claim her. The experience led Pamela to unearth the growing phenomenon of Americans, up to 150,000 of whom are going unclaimed after their deaths each year. She and her co-author dug into the processes, the people, the policies, and the social structures that are responsible, and today we're talking about what she learned. We examine how different cities and countries handle their unclaimed dead, why those left behind often have a lot to say, and why complete strangers are now routinely showing up to mass burial ceremonies nationwide to mourn many of the unclaimed who they never knew. We look at which portion of the population has the highest risk of going unclaimed, and why the stories of the 4 people she presents in the book hit so close to home. The Unclaimed can inspire readers to elevate our real personal connections to the top of our priorities where they deserve to be. Our cult of independence is killing us, perhaps more slowly than we even realize. How does it matter if we go unclaimed? Is it about religion, obligation, the fabric of a functional society? What do we owe each other? Pamela opens up about her own estrangement from her father and how she has determined, no matter what, that if called upon one day, no matter how much time may have passed, she says she will claim him. Until I read your book, The Unclaimed, I had absolutely no idea, nor would I, that 150,000 Americans are going unclaimed after they die each year. What does it mean exactly to go unclaimed?
So to go unclaimed means that at the time you die, there is no family, no next of kin willing or able to claim your body. And as you said, there's a large number of Americans, a rising number of Americans who are at risk of this. And there are a number of reasons. Some of them were a little bit unexpected for me, but fundamentally, this is something that really gets into some of the existential questions of life. Who will be there for you when you meet life's end?
There's a couple of different parts of that to parse, because there's the question of who will be there for you at the end, and then who will be there for you after the end, and sort of does it matter? So we're going to go down a bit of a philosophical rabbit hole, but I want to start with, did you intend this to be a wake-up call? You spent 8 years researching this. Was that
Yeah. Yeah, so as you had mentioned, it wasn't something that was on your radar, and this was certainly not something that was on my radar. I had actually been doing my dissertation research at a mosque in South Central LA for many years, and spending my nights and weekends and Muslim holidays there. And during Ramadan one year, there was actually the imam got up one night of Ramadan, and he announced that one of the longtime members had passed away. She had returned to Allah, and she was on the path towards going unclaimed, which, he said her body was sitting unclaimed in the county morgue. And the community, he rallied to raise funds to go to court to get the right to claim her body and to provide her with a Muslim burial. And a lot of this had to do with two things. One, trying to avoid cremation, which is what happens with indigent, unclaimed deaths in Los Angeles, and the community believing very firmly in a burial. And then the second was, this is a duty that we have as a community to this sister, and the idea that they were, enacting family in a really unique, for me as a scholar, a unique way. And so that was something that just woke me up. I hadn't thought about this subject before. And so I got a wake-up call pretty early on just to the very idea. And then I didn't think it would take 8 years. I'm going to be really honest with you. I thought I would have been done with this a lot sooner. But it just was so incredibly difficult to get information from the county, to get access to just even basic things like how many people in LA go unclaimed every year. How many have gone unclaimed over an extended period of time? What happens with their bodies? What happens with their estates? And it took so much time to get answers to those questions. I knew there had to be a deeper story here. I knew that there had to be something that was worthy of my attention.
Well, and I know you're an associate professor of sociology, but you were also a writer and a broadcaster before this. So the idea of chasing down the story makes a lot of sense. But I also understand you have an estranged relationship with your own father through no choice of your own. To jump ahead a little bit, after everything that you have said in the book that regardless of whether or not your relationship becomes unestranged, you do plan to claim him. What do you think you owe him?
I didn't go into writing a book about unclaimed deaths thinking that ultimately I was going to be writing about estrangement. But that is, in fact, what we find is the cause for a lot of people who are going unclaimed. At the point that the county calls that legal next of kin, very often what they find is that that kin has been disconnected for years, sometimes decades, from the person who's passed away. And so, I thought this would be a lot more of a clear-cut story about poverty and money and the rising cost of funerals, and those are certainly factors. But the family estrangement really came out as this, surprising finding, if you will.
Well, I'm sure. And it really does center around estrangement. I wonder if there is any statistic, although even as I'm saying it, I'm assuming there is no statistic on how many people are going unclaimed because there is no blood-related next of kin to claim them, versus how many people are going unclaimed because even if someone blood-related wants to claim them, the high cost, they just simply can't get there. You tell these 4 stories in the book of people who pass and come from all different walks of life and who have such different life stories, and also their stories evolve. And you can see how family estrangement can be fixed. You can see how money doesn't mean you don't die without anyone to claim you. And you can also see how being unclaimed is not the same thing as being unmourned, right? Because you tell this story of someone whose father passes, but his father was not listed on his birth certificate, so he can't claim his father. And then even if he could, does he have the money to fly there, to get the body, to do everything that needs to be done? And there's a lot of anger, and there are a lot of, calcified resentments and things in the background. When you talked about that particular story and the young man who wanted to claim his father, who he had met maybe twice in his life, because he was legally the next of kin that was called, it brought up a lot of questions. And the biggest one for me was, you use this term monotophobia, which is the fear of dying alone. But the fear of dying alone is different than the fear of being unclaimed after you die. Dying alone is the 5 minutes before your last breath. But it's more the fear of dying without consequence, because the dead don't know if anyone mourned them. Arguably, depending on what religion you follow, the dead don't know if anyone cried. I had someone very close to me pass away when I was in my early 20s, and I recall being angry at how many people mourned his death who I knew weren't there for him in his life. I always believed that death only hurts the living. So I wonder philosophically, why does it matter if we're not claimed in body after our deaths? Arguably, the dead don't know there were no ceremonies after their passing.
Mm-hmm. Well, so this is an age-old question, right? As long as human beings and our predecessors have lived, we've been asking this question. And throughout time, the answer has been burial matters. Burial is what makes us human. It's what sets us apart from other species, right? So we have evidence of, in the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods of burial rituals of people burying with, with artifacts across time, right? We see the traditions of ancient Egyptians and, the Romans, ancient Romans would actually, the worst punishment you could imagine was to be erased after death. And that's what they would do, is they would go through and condemn people to oblivion after they had died. And so there was a way of sort of creating fear and instilling order through that. So across history and time, this has been something that we've done. And when it comes to the idea of going unclaimed, there's really, it raises a number of questions. What is the meaning of your life if you haven't had an impact on others? I mean, this is one of the kind of questions that we pose, and I'm not going to try to tell people what to believe. That's not what I see as my role as an author. But it is to get you to ask the hard questions. This is a book that asks you to reflect not just on yourself, but on your relationships, on the choices that you make, right? We have so much emphasis in this country on making money and, squirreling stuff away and proving our success through material items. That's not going to go with you when you die either. So what's the point of that? I mean, we quote this saying towards the end of the book, which has been found in a number of different cultures. They say we die twice. Once when the breath leaves our body, and once when the last person we know says our name. And I think that goes to the heart of what you're asking about, this fear of going unclaimed. What does it say about the life you lived? And in some cases, some heartbreaking situations, people are sort of socially dead before they've had their last breath. And that's also not just reflecting on the individual life. I would say it's reflecting on the society as a whole. So we are, survey after survey finds we are feeling more isolated, more alone. The Surgeon General has called that we have this epidemic of social isolation, and we need to prioritize connection. So I see this book that I've co-authored with, I should say, my colleague Stefan Timmermans at UCLA. We've authored this book that we hope really sort of fits in this larger conversation about what kind of society do we want? Do we want to imagine one where we are prioritizing connection as the root of what it's all about? Or, do you disagree with that?
Well, I'm glad I came across the book for a lot of reasons, but one is, in this conversation, I thought you were going to tell me more about religion. I thought you were going to go into the social history of the idea that there's an afterlife. Because if you start talking to me about Egyptians burying with things, we're talking about what happens to the being or to the sentient self or to the soul or whatever after the physical body. And then it goes into religion, and then it becomes an easy answer why people are going unclaimed, because people are not that religious anymore, so they're not concerned about Jesus or afterlife or any of the things. I'm Hindu, so I don't really feel such an attachment to the body, but I do feel an attachment to the people, because I think that's our job on this planet. But I like that you make sort of the distinction between burial, I guess, I won't even say burial, right? It can be cremation, but
Yeah, of course.
ceremony upon death being about consequence, not necessarily about religion. It's about whether you had consequence, right? And it's powerful stuff when you think about how much it's growing, but it's also powerful just if you think about it in and of itself. You say that, I remember you said that in Maryland, the number of unclaimed deaths has doubled in the last 20 years. That was shocking to me because this is America. This is America. What an idiotic way for me to think of it, but that's how I felt. And when I think about migration and the changes that are happening with mass industrialization in other countries, we know there are more unclaimed in other countries. We just know that because in India, for example, people stayed close and were in a joint family from birth till death, and nobody was ever alone. Now they move into the big cities, they never come back, and it's happening. And you quote Korea, I think South Korea as well. 8.8% of its population enduring lonely deaths to the point that they have a name for it. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what the government is doing about that, and then do you feel philosophically that what the South Korean government is doing demonstrates a philosophical commitment to grace, or is it just a financially logical decision?
There's a lot there to unpack. So let me just back up for one moment about religion. So I, came into this, as I said, having been studying a mosque. I was a scholar of religion, a sociologist of religion. So I certainly thought religion would be more coming up in people's answers. And religion is there, and it still is, a primary way to draw on rituals after death, right, to mark deaths. But it was less about this notion of, if you think of certain cultures of like a haunting, right? The dead are going to haunt us. That's not what it's about. It's about marking a life lived. And why does that matter? Well, if we can just erase that people lived, if we don't pay attention and mark their lives, what's to say somebody will mark ours? What's to say that we matter, right? So it's this relationship between the living and the dead that is at the root of what we're trying to get at, right? And so in caring for the dead, what can we as the living also gain is part of the equation. And thinking about international cases, so as you pointed out, South Korea has had a rise in the number of what they call lonely deaths. Japan as well. I think Japan is further ahead than anybody in thinking about this topic. And what is South Korea doing? Well, one of them is to hire organizations to provide burials or markings right after somebody has been cremated. So they're having personal ceremonies for individuals who pass, who are alone, who have no next of kin. And I think it was this, it's similar in Japan, is this notion of what does this say about who we are as a society? Because the cheapest thing to do is quite often what we do across the United States, which is get rid of bodies as easily as possible, as efficiently as possible. There are places throughout the United States where unclaimed bodies are cremated, their ashes are scattered at sea in kind of mass sea burials. So that could be one way of doing it, right? And the way that many places do that. But what LA is doing differently, what South Korea has sought to do, what Japan is having conversations about is saying, okay, wait a minute. What are the opportunities here for demonstrating that we can, do society in a different way? So, I think Japan, for example, has seen the rise in lonely deaths as a marker of just absolutely a kind of breakdown in all aspects of community there, right? So the breakdown in family and multi-generational households, but also the breakdown in what used to be this kind of company-driven society, right? If you worked for a company long enough, the company would provide you a grave. And so that's not happening anymore. I recently attended an international conference on lonely deaths at Cambridge University, and one of the speakers was talking about how people in Japan who do still really believe in having graves continue to be treated with care, literally cleaning of the graves, right? And showing up on important holidays to, leave offerings at that grave. That's traditionally and historically been done by family. And people there who are afraid of dying and not having family willing to do that for them are now hiring companies to provide that service for them. So they're paying before they die into a service so that they can be marked. I mean, this goes to that notion, right? It's not the same thing as the fear of dying alone. It's the fear of having your life have mattered, right? Having people there for you in your aftercare.
And this is in perpetuity? They want their grave visited in perpetuity?
Well, the idea is that, your family, you would recognize, and that you'd be part of an ancestry, a lineage over time, right?
They say 100 years after we go, no one will remember our name. And that is generally, right, something people can make their peace with. In the context of a family, I am a mother. I think when I'm a grandmother, maybe my grandchildren will live another 75 years after my death. And maybe they will mention me to their grandchildren once or twice, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody will remember me after that. I think if you remembered 100 years after your death, you actually did pretty well, right? But that doesn't seem to hurt. And the idea of having a place to visit is definitely a bit of a religiously specific notion, because we do cremate, and I have always thought of the concept of the ashes being done and scattered as freeing. But that the memory is important. You want to be remembered. You want to be celebrated. You want to be appreciated. You want to be missed. You want to be loved. You want them to talk about how pretty you were, how much you did for them, all the things, right? And the irony of it is it might very well, for a growing number of Americans, not be the family, right? It might be what you call these surrogate kinship networks. Can you define what that is?
Sure. So, fewer and fewer Americans are living in what we consider a traditional or standard family, right? Fewer of us are getting married than ever before. Fewer people are having children. More people are living alone. But that doesn't mean that they're lonely. It doesn't mean that they don't have loved ones, right, in their lives, even if they're not legally connected to one another. There are rich, meaningful connections and relationships that people foster. Right? I think about, deep friendships that I've had for 30 plus years since I was a child, right? And they are like family to me. They are family to me.
They are family, yeah.
And in some ways I can think they might be, in many situations, the most appropriate people, if you're looking at the quality of the relationship, to determine what should happen in your disposition, right? They might know more for you what you would want than, say, a cousin who is legally connected to you.
Right.
Maybe related by blood, but isn't necessarily somebody with whom you've had regular contact, right?
But the law doesn't recognize surrogate kinship.
No. So this is, it depends on what parts of the law we talk about, right? And so I've been looking at different policies in terms of, what's recognized as kin, as family. And it varies widely, the United States being a federation of states, it's going to vary by state. But I was surprised in California, where we did our research, that up until, the latter part of the 2010s, domestic partnerships were not recognized legally in California if it was outside of a same-sex relationship or outside one of the members of that partnership being of a certain age. So I think it was 60, 62 and older. So if you were sort of middle-aged or younger and you had been partnered with somebody, up until fairly recently, California didn't recognize that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's California, right? And I don't, wherever your listeners are, we have certain perception of where California is relative to other places, right? Yeah. And so it really does depend where in America you are, where things will be recognized. And I should say, we were a little bit surprised at how firm we saw government officials enacting this very rigid definition. And I say rigid with the recognition that there was a next of kin hierarchy on their walls with 26 boxes. So they will keep going till they find somebody, to a certain extent, under time pressures and resources that are limited. But friends are not anywhere in there.
Wow.
in those 26 boxes. So, and non-registered partnerships are not in one of those boxes. So this is a way in which we may not be living our lives, to fit a kind of traditional standard family model, but at the point of death, at the point of who has the right to claim a body, the law is still fairly narrow, and I don't see movements to change that. I think we've seen some of that effort, right? We started to see some of this during the AIDS epidemic with same-sex relationships. But you also saw a push towards allowed gay marriage, right? And so that's fitting within the contemporary context of what is a legally recognized relationship. There have been some movements in the foster care system, right, to recognize chosen family or surrogate kinship. But again, it's not something that's to my knowledge, reached a widespread kind of movement.
So no one, to your knowledge, has even introduced a piece of legislation or a potential change to a local law that would recognize non-blood surrogate kinship networks?
In the context of disposition, not to my knowledge, but I would welcome anyone who wants to alert me to something happening I'm not aware of to reach out and tell me.
I grew up with a very traditional family. I'm a big fan of all the family and all the stuff and all the cousins and all the great uncle twice removed kind of. I'm a big fan of it all. I'm also completely aware that that is not the norm. It was not even the norm when I was growing up to have so much close family, and it's changing every day. In cases of abuse or family abandonment or someone rejecting who a child is, we can all agree. I'm sure anybody at least listening to my podcast can agree that family of origin cannot be primary, right? Blood family of origin in those cases, because abuse is abuse. But I would guess that those things are not the root of the majority of family estrangements in America today. Just given the overall tenor of our culture and the fact that nobody can disagree and everybody's right, overall, there's two different ways you can go. After 8 years of research, do you believe that the better solution is to just sort of accept the breakdown of the American extended family for what it is and normalize prioritizing surrogate kinship networks when it comes to disposition? Or do you believe the better solution is to somehow counteract the growing trend of family estrangement? Because we should have both. We should have our chosen kinship networks and our others. But if you had to choose one, what would you hope?
Let me preface by saying that what you describe as how you grew up, I envy that. I would have loved that. I would have loved a big family. I would have relished the opportunity to raise my child in a situation in which she had lots of aunts and uncles and cousins, and I'm an only child. And I turned out to have an only child myself, despite wanting this big family. And I think part of that gets at my bigger answer, which is the pressure on families to do it all. That families have to be the social safety net for everything in the United States, right? We don't have an advanced, mature, in any way welfare system. Regardless of what a listener's, kind of political orientations are, you have to admit that there's just not a lot we do to support families. Now that can become really politically polarizing, right, in terms of like what that means, but the fact is we do expect. So if you think about, inequality, if you think about poverty, we expect for the most part families to figure it out. If you think about mental illness, untreated mental illnesses, we expect families to do the work. We call it community care, which we've had since deinstitutionalization, but fundamentally it's family care. It's parents and children and siblings picking up the burden of care. If you think about the drug addiction and epidemics throughout many parts of the United States, again, who's the first line of defense and the main line of defense to kind of help somebody out? It's the family. And so we put so much pressure, especially on nuclear families, to do it all. that it isn't really surprising to me in that sense that they're kind of crumbling under the weight of that pressure. So I would argue that whatever we do going forward, one of the best ways we can help solve the problem of the unclaimed is to think about a social safety net. Think about repairing our systems to work for us, to benefit families, while also recognizing that families are diverse. So I'm not gonna go with one or the other. I got to say they're connected, because I think that's what it is. I think it's, there's a limitation of policy to recognize chosen family, but there's also a failure of policy to really nurture and protect families of origin as well.
Well, and part of what you mentioned is mental illness, and I put PTSD and things like that in that category. When I first started reading your book, I assumed I would find a lot about large swaths of this problem being our veterans who are not okay and are not getting the help that they need, and everyone knows that, right? But no one's putting enough money behind it, obviously. I don't know how there could ever be enough money really to handle the support that people who've been traumatized so intensely on our behalf deserve to have. I assumed that would be what it was, and that was not the way that it went. Overall, it just keeps coming back to estrangement. To me, this is a book about how estrangement is changing America and really the future of sort of humanity. Have you come across any research or statistics on what it takes to end estrangement, how it can be ended, what the chances are that a family estrangement ends before we pass?
I'm going to speak mostly on behalf of what I know in my discipline, which is sociology, although I would say there's far more research that's been done in social work on estrangement as well as psychology, for obvious reasons. Sociology has, a little bit of a growing area of research around estrangement, not as much as you would expect. I think this is one of the things that would love to see my discipline do more research on estrangement. We could talk about whether or not I'm the right person to do that. Right. After this book took a lot out of me, and I just I don't know if I can if I'm ready just quite yet to take on this additional research. But there's been some work around kind of first trying to understand what are the causes of estrangement, and you referred to abuse. Of course, abuse and history of conflict factors in value differences, right? And this can kind of get at some of the stuff we talked about earlier, differences in religion. Right? So in the books that I've read on estrangement, it's not always that the author is pointing out religion as a key factor, but when I read the quotes that are given from people who are estranged, oftentimes there is some sort of disagreement about religion and the role of religion, right? And in how maybe adult children are choosing to live their lives, and maybe parents not wanting to, fully agreeing with those choices. In some ways, we need family more than ever right now. But on the other hand, there's also ways in which we are increasingly living our lives as independent units of our parents, right, when we grow up. And so maybe people are feeling a little bit more freedom, ability to separate themselves from those families of origin. You also find a lot of disagreements over race and sexuality as well. And so these are, to the extent that these are identity issues, and you think about the America that we have today and how difficult it is to have conversations about difficult subjects. I can see it's, I don't know how to tell somebody. I don't have the tools yet to tell somebody, okay, if you're disagreeing over sexuality, religion, race, how you just get over that, right? That just seems like a really kind of weak answer to give somebody, or suggestion to give somebody. But I think there's some work that psychologists have done. There's definitely a push in therapeutic circles to think about how repair happens. It being both parties come to the table willing to recognize. And I am seeing a little bit more, surprisingly to me, based on what traditionally the research has said, of people younger, I would say younger scholars, younger therapists sort of saying, it's not about treating that as something that has to be repaired, but accepting that this is the situation and sort of moving forward. So there's a whole range. And we talked briefly about some of the four people and their stories, and at different times, it's not as though you're necessarily completely estranged from someone. Things can ebb and flow, right? We tell the story of Lena Brown, right? And she was living alone and very independent by all measures, like what a lot of Americans believe in. Let me live on my own for as long as I possibly can. At some point, she just got too old to do it on her own. Right. And the county got involved because friends and neighbors were worried about her. And then her family did, nieces and nephews did become involved in helping to care for her. And then they sort of are in and out of her life at different points, right? They have their own, traumas and situations that they're dealing with as well. And so it wasn't that you could clearly say, throughout her life course, Lena Brown was estranged from her family.
Right.
No, it moved, right? As our lives always do. And I think one of the objectives I would have in this conversation and with the book is just to say, look, you may not be estranged right now. This may not be a category of a relationship with which you identify, but just recognize that this exists on a spectrum, right? And there's different levels of extremity of the estrangement. And so...
And you don't know what's going to happen.
No.
Right? I mean, I think that's the power of your book, is it shows how precarious it is for all of us. It doesn't matter if you have money, it doesn't matter if you have friends, it doesn't matter if you have kids, it doesn't matter if you have cousins who annoy you as much as you annoy them, but you love each other. It doesn't matter. One or two changes, right? One or two things could happen. Someone could move somewhere. Someone's daughter could be offended by something that you said. Someone could get into a financially tough situation. Someone could marry someone who changes their perspective on you. And it's just terrifying to think that family, true kinship, blood kinship, is so fragile.
Well, yes and no. So I completely agree with you when it comes to thinking about unclaimed deaths. But keep in mind that millions die every year in America who do get claimed, right? So more often than not, people are getting claimed, right? Even if it's up to 4%, 96% are getting claimed, right? So there's still strength in family there. We're not completely in the swamps. But, the other thing I would point out that, hope is in the subtitle for a reason. And you mentioned veterans, right? And there are about 200 veterans every year in Los Angeles County alone who are going unclaimed.
Yeah.
But they're being marked. They're being honored. They're receiving full military funeral benefits and honors because there's a group of veterans who are standing up to say, we are going to be their family for them. And, we take you into that group, we take you into those ceremonies, and we show you what it means not just to honor that unclaimed veteran, but for the living veterans as well.
You also bring up, and this was very surprising to me, these beautiful collective mourning events that sort of bring our mortality and our relationships to light, and things that are happening in Los Angeles, things that are happening in other cities. But the other thing you discuss in really, really good detail was the people who claim, bury, and mourn babies that didn't belong to them. The idea that newborn babies who are born stillborn are often left in the hospital. No matter what you believe about the reasons why people end up unclaimed, I think it's easy to look at a book like this and tell yourself that people who end up unclaimed on some level brought it on themselves. It's easy to be cold and say in your mind that they allowed their relationships to lapse. They got themselves into a situation where they weren't wanted. They didn't make the effort with their own families. They messed up in this lifetime. Nobody can say that towards a baby, right? Because essentially a group of people are coming together out of sympathy to mourn a baby, which is essentially just potential. It was just, it was a being with potential. Do you think it's easier for them to mourn the babies than anything else because they don't have anything to judge?
No, I think actually it's harder. It's harder. I mean, I think, well, I would want to say that I hope after reading the book, you wouldn't feel the way that it's on necessarily, people
No,
get
I
it.
know. I
Yeah,
wouldn't feel
yeah,
that
yeah.
way, but I'm
But
saying it
for the
would be easy
babies,
for people to dismiss
yeah,
it.
right. No, I've definitely seen a couple of reactions, like, for example, on Goodreads, of people like, oh, I expected there to be more homeless people in this. I expected there
Right,
to be more
exactly.
people dying on the street, as though that was an indictment of the book rather than an awareness of like what this means about American society. But
Right.
to the babies, look, this is I still get chills, all these years later, just when you started mentioning that, because it's in some ways the hardest work to do. It's, as you said, an infant who dies is a lost opportunity in so many different ways. And so the folks who come together, the strangers who come together to, bury what have been classified by government officials as abandoned infants and children, this is an effort to try to right what they see as just the most egregious wrong. And why would you take that on? Like, why would you spend your Saturday morning when you have so many other things to do taking on this burden? And so that was a question we came into this as scholars, empirically, like, why would you do this?
What is your deal?
Why, right. And I was so struck by the need for healing that so many of those attendants at the ceremonies had. So many Americans have suffered miscarriages and stillbirths. And we don't have a very sophisticated way of addressing that publicly, of acknowledging those losses. We don't have, to my knowledge, not as commonly a set of rituals, right? We tend to think, in general, of grief as very private. It didn't used to be that way, right? And it's not that way in every culture or religion within the country, but more often than not, people have shown, right? Joan Didion in The Year of Magical Thinking has this amazing sort of reflection back on the kind of Emily Post approach to grief, and then what happens in contemporary times when we see, well, you're just supposed to deal with that in your own home. And, these are folks who very often don't want to deal with their grief on their own. And sociology tells us that coming together in these difficult moments, through these rituals, sharing emotions together, crying together, even if the person next to me, and maybe even be more because they're a stranger, is an opportunity for me to feel part of a larger humanity. It repairs some of the rips to our social fabric. And so that's what I found with the attendants who show up at these ceremonies that are very carefully calibrated in terms of the organization that we studied and we focus on. They're explicitly leaving abortion out of the conversation.
And
yeah,
exactly. I noticed that.
Yeah. And many are, they say babies and infants, many are fetuses. And so by California state law, any fetus beyond 20 weeks gestation is required to have a burial permit. So if a distraught mother, for obvious reasons, is in the hospital and cannot at that time handle that, I don't know how well those hospitals communicate to the mothers that if they don't do something, that's considered an abandoned, body.
That is so intense. I had no idea. At 20
Yeah.
weeks, I don't know anyone who hasn't had a miscarriage, by the way.
Yeah.
I pretty much don't know anyone who hasn't had a miscarriage, and I'm in my 40s at this point. We talk about it like we talk about anything. Nobody's private in my circles about these sorts of things. Obviously, I'm in a specific slice of society where we talk about all things, but there's so much there. You make me think about, the original intention behind this podcast. There's a reason why I call it the release. And the idea is that I've been going at it thinking we all need an emotional release. And how can we get it? We can get it by sharing our stories, by answering some of the simple, more loaded questions, and by witnessing other people who are doing incredible things, giving themselves the grace that they need. We will be inspired to do it to ourselves. If you're listening, you will hear Pamela's story, Pamela's research, and Pamela's feeling about her own father, and our discussion about the philosophical ramifications of what it means to go unclaimed, and whether you can ever really belong to anyone, and whether it even matters. And you can feel a little bit more like everyone's in the same boat, right? But through all of these conversations that I'm having conversations with people who study and work in wildly different fields. But the through line that keeps popping up is we're all so lonely, and we crave the village. We crave the village that we as humans have had for thousands of years, and now we're just walking around saying, I'm fine. My village is on my Instagram. There's no village on your Instagram. Nobody cares. There is nobody, There is no village in your neighborhood of people who you just say hello to once in a while. That's not a village. Village are people who know you and see you, right? And so when you tell me about strangers coming together to mourn people of any age who they never met, who passed without anyone to claim them, I sit there and I think, God, is that what it takes for people to let it go and let the guard down and give themselves enough of a moment that they can weep for the things that they've lost, for the fear that they will be unclaimed? It's, in a way, the image that you depict of these mass annual mournings in Los Angeles, in a way, it makes me happy to know that even in the absence of the typical trappings of the village, people want to show up like a village for each other, whether they knew each other or not. But in a way, it makes me really sad, because it's like, how many people who are there never get a good cry, except for that one night a year? And we should all be crying all the time. We should all be letting all the things out, and we should be finding kin and making sure that that kin is recognized. Anyway, that's my diatribe.
Well, can I just say really quickly to that? I mean, part of the release, I think, look, we can keep hiding and trying to escape from the world we're living in, or we can lean into it. And there's a lot of different ways of doing that, right? My hope is that I've written a book that is not going to tell you exactly what to believe, but you're going to get out of it what you need, right? So wherever you're at in your life, if you read this book and you're touched, I'm going to guess it's going to reflect what parts of the book touch you, or you find really heartening or difficult. Are the areas where maybe that's an opportunity to try to lean into thinking more and doing more and trying to get that release. There's also the beauty in people coming together at this annual ceremony, this interfaith multilingual ceremony that we write about in Los Angeles, and just being around other people who feel the same way. And so there's this beauty, it's a bittersweet beauty, in that you're coming together for what seems like something that should be difficult, but in fact, people leave in a better mood than they came. And so the tears are tears of release, and then they leave and they're quiet, they're respectful, there's reverence, but there's actually a tremendous amount of renewed hope we see in having been around other people who feel the same way. Because as you said, we're not living in villages like we did in millennia past. And certainly the algorithms are such that you're not going to have that nurtured when you're on social media. And so, coming to the ceremony in every year, it renews my faith in humanity, frankly, in a way that nothing else in my day-to-day life does. And I hope that I carry that forward in the months to come, beyond having written this book, but just as a person, as a member of a community, that I do that. And I pay attention to the vulnerable who are living among us. I mean, that's what we really try to do with this book. It's a book about death that's ultimately about the living. So if you show up to mourn the unclaimed of any age, of any background, regardless what their political beliefs or their economic backgrounds or their racial backgrounds or religious backgrounds, if you can go and you can care in that moment, use that to think about how to care for the vulnerable among us still, while we can still do something, right, to help them.
Alive.
Yeah, yeah.
So you go every year to these mass mourning ceremonies?
Yeah.
I can see how much you get out of it. I'm sure that a lot of people get a lot out of it. There's one quote in the book, one section that I thought was a good cautionary tale. And I told myself when I started this podcast I was never going to read anything from anyone's book because I was interested in the concept. I'm interested in the people and the concept. I interview people who are world-renowned experts on psychedelic plant medicine, people who are someone who has the Guinness Book record for the largest number of insect tattoos on a human body. I'm interviewing people who are, changing law around sexual assault and employment arbitration clauses. Just wildly different topics. And we keep going back to, we need each other, we need each other, we need each other in every single podcast. And this is what I had to dog ear in your book, where you say, this was heartening and terrifying. You say, the men most at risk for ending up unclaimed are unmarried or divorced. Women have their own risks. Never getting married is riskier than divorce when it comes to having someone to claim them. Women are also likely to outlive their spouses. The racial differences in going unclaimed can also be explained by shifting family ties. Although households of all racial compositions are fragmenting, the decline of traditional families is most common among white Americans, and the association between family isolation and going unclaimed is significantly stronger for white than for black Los Angeles residents. As if people in middle age don't face enough existential angst, demographic research shows that they are one of the fastest growing segments of the population without nuclear family ties. What the spike in unclaimed really reflects then is the transformation of the American family. And I thought, single or divorced white men my age, that's the biggest risk group.
Yep.
And you just sit with that and you think about all the reasons, and you start to think about your male friends. I'm dating after divorce. I'm in my mid-40s, and there is an undercurrent of loneliness in people that I meet. They have it all, Oh, they look fantastic. And they have their money, and they have their life, and they have their charm, and they're really good people. I really haven't met a lot of terrible people. Generally, I'm in New York. Maybe I'm in a nice pool of people, new people to meet in your 40s. But when I ask if they're lonely, because I'm inappropriate and I ask these questions to strangers, they always say, no. And I say, oh, really? I kind of don't believe them. Something about middle-aged men with no one else living in the house feels very different than middle-aged women with no one else living in the house. Because you've got at least 7 people to call right now after this podcast and tell how annoying this woman was that just interviewed. At least 7 people who will be like, oh, she sounds terrible. So
I think you get at exactly what we're trying to kind of raise some alarm bells, that there's lonely as this subjective feeling, right? And they may say they're not lonely, but then the question is, how many social ties do you have? How often are you in contact with people? Isolation is being being distinct from loneliness in the sense that it's an objective measure of how many people do you have to call to help you out in a time of crisis, or to even share that you've had a bad day, right? I sometimes catch myself because I worry that I'm too much of a complainer sometimes, and that I'm like a downer. And so I have a large... What's that?
Your would say no.
No, they would say you're always going deeper, and you never have just an easy day because you just are always seeking the most from life every minute. But I do have a lot of friends, and so I actually am sort of intentional in where I spread my complaining, if you will. because I don't want to burden, some of my very closest friends. It's just like, okay, well, this 30 years, you know who I am. I'm not going to be somebody different. But then sometimes I'm strategic, and I have that possibility because I've put a lot of effort in cultivating friendships. I've got friends in many parts of the world, and this way I'm really grateful for the ease of communication across distance and through, various online technologies. But, research shows that men, as they age, have shrinking social circles. They have fewer friends. They have fewer connections. They're the most likely to be estranged from their adult children. Of course, mothers can also be estranged from their children, but father relationships tend to be the most strained. So in some ways, this is sort of, as you read from the end of the book, it's the beginning of a new conversation. And I would challenge people to read the book and come out of it saying, what can we do to heed the Surgeon General's call to create policies that promote connection? How do we build different urban centers? In Europe, there's been work done in Scandinavia in particular, just to build our cities differently, to encourage people to get outside and to meet one another and to make friends. Well, of course, right?
That's not everything, because that's where isn't that where the majority of women have babies whenever they want to have babies, and they feel no pressure whatsoever to marry the person they had the baby with? They just pick the genes. They're like, you're tall, okay, right?
Well, they have the best parental leave policies for mothers and fathers.
Support, right? Because it's normal. So they're raising their babies, everybody's happy, and they're like, I don't know, I saw my dad yesterday, all's well, where's my pancakes? Everyone's good.
Well, and I often hear when I reference this stuff, they say, well, Scandinavia is a really homogenous society, and so we can never have that here because we're so diverse. I don't think that's our problem. Our problem is not that we're diverse. My dearest friends were all different ethnic, religious, kind of cultural backgrounds. So it's not about that. It's not about the heterogeneity in American society. It's about the choices that we're making and the individualism that we worship, right? If we've replaced religion with anything, it's the worship of the individual. And, I'm now getting on my soapbox a little bit beyond the scope of the book, but, that's a thread that is throughout the book. We're not going to hit you over the head with it, but I'm going to suspect that most people will come out of it if they've read it and they're going to think, wow, we really do have this emphasis that the individual has to do it all.
Oh, absolutely. I like the idea that you decided to write this by telling 4 stories. So the concept of a social autopsy was something I had never heard before. One of the things you point out is, among other surprises in your research, how willing the family members were to talk. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, you're referring to the family members who chose not to claim, so the family members of the decedents who do end up unclaimed. I think, like you probably find in the context of this podcast and the work that you do, people are craving an opportunity to have their story heard from their own perspective. And so a lot of people wanted to, talk to us and just give their perspective, right? In a lot of cases, friends and neighbors really wanted the stories to be told because they didn't want it to end with the idea, well, this person went into a mass grave, without their name attached to it, that it renders them invisible. It's just kind of social erasure. And, even some family members said, well, I think it's really great that you're telling the stories of Midge and Bobby and Nina and David, right? Because otherwise they would, by all accounts, probably sort of fade into oblivion, right? And so I think that it goes back to the fact that a lot of families are struggling. There were stories. I had this one woman who, I don't write about her in the book, but it's part of the 8 years of research. So I tell it. Her brother went unclaimed, and I knocked on the door where she lived, and there was no answer. So I left a handwritten note, as I do, and sort of said who I am. Here's my business card. Could you give me a call? And this was several years ago. when before I was at the University of Amsterdam, and she first tried to vet who I was. So she called my university that I was at, she called the chair of the department, wanted to verify that I actually existed. And then she did get a hold of me eventually, and she was really upset because she thought that I was somebody who was coming to collect on her brother's drug debts, and that I was posing as a researcher and a sociologist. And we ended up spending the next hour on the phone, and it was, a mix of yelling about her brother, crying about her brother, just feeling that she had been so wronged. And she had absolutely no qualms about telling me, why she made the decisions that she made. And I think in that case, it was just, I went through this. This was a pain that I experienced. And there's a value in sharing that story with somebody else and having that kind of experience validated. So that's just kind of one example of a family member who you would think would not want to talk, but in fact was quite eager to.
All anyone has ever wanted is to be seen. And if we go unclaimed, do we feel like we never were? Thank you for writing the book and for being on the release.